You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode number 20 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. Today, I'm really excited to be sharing a conversation that I had with Deb W from West Virginia, where we talked about intimacy and sexual avoidance, something that I've wanted to talk on the podcast about for a while. In episode 3, which was my story, my experience, strength, and hope, I talked a little bit about my sexual avoidant behaviors. And I've also answered some listener emails about what ISA is, Intimacy and Sexual Avoidance. And I've touched on it, whether it be in episodes about the 3 circles or some other conversations, but I have yet to have an in-depth discussion about intimacy and sexual avoidance. Over the years, it has evolved from sexual anorexia to compulsive sexual avoidance, and now to where it currently is intimacy avoidance. And in our conversation, Deb goes over the difference between the various terms and how it's evolved. So I first became familiar with Deb's work in the ISA movement through listening to her various workshops that she's done on the subject at international conventions. And I finally got to meet her at the 2018 convention in Oakland, when I attended the workshop on intimacy and sexual avoidance there. She also came to the workshop that I did on music and recovery. As we mentioned in our conversation, the intimacy and sexual avoidance groups, the telemeetings, were really responsible for helping SAA meetings move into Zoom, starting off on telephone meetings and then moving into the Zoom format. They were kind of the pioneers to really start using that platform. A few years ago, they did an ISA awareness campaign where they invited lots of different people around the country to join in on some of the Zoom meetings and to see what Zoom could do. Shortly after that, the Bay Area Intergroup wanted to learn how to use Zoom for our intergroup meetings. And so we asked Deb to help walk us through how Zoom worked. And this was probably 2019. So when the pandemic hit, we were a little bit familiar, but over the past year, we've gotten a lot familiar with Zoom. So as I had mentioned, the ISA meetings are primarily telemeetings, and I've joined in on a few. And a lot of times they read from the pamphlet, which really introduced me into ISA. It used to be a pamphlet called Compulsive Sexual Avoidance, A Return to Intimacy. Now they've retitled it, calling it Intimacy Avoidance, Another Aspect of Sex Addiction. And at the ISA-focused meetings, they read a list of 18 symptoms of intimacy and sexual avoidance, and I wanted to read them from this pamphlet. Becoming aware of the ways we have avoided intimacy was, for some sex addicts, like colliding with a much bigger part of an iceberg below the waterline. Below is a list of avoidant behaviors that some of us have struggled with. 1. Practicing avoidance of sexual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. 2. Obsessive sexual thoughts about having sex and/or avoiding it. 3. A feeling that our sexuality is inherently bad and something that we should feel ashamed of and guilty about. 4. Pretending that flirtation and sexual advances aren't really happening to us and acting uninterested purely based on fear of taking risks. 5, a pattern of sex and relationships with active sex addicts or other unavailable people. 6, a pattern of addictive sexual behavior acting out, followed by a pattern of compulsive sexual avoidance acting in. 7, extreme fear of combining emotional intimacy with sexuality. 8, finding fault or starting fights with a spouse or partner to avoid sexual relations. 9, being emotionally unavailable in sexual and non-sexual relationships. 10, only socializing in groups to avoid one-on-one relationships. 11, avoiding social situations altogether due to extreme discomfort. 12, only being sexual in non-intimate situations. 13, an inability to accept nurturing and care from ourselves, our higher power, and others. 14, an inability to trust and rely on others, believing that people will always let us down and it is safer if we just do things on our own. 15, the compulsive use of masturbation with fantasy and or pornography as a way to avoid intimacy with others and prevent sexual abandonment. 16, mistaking compulsive sexual avoidance for recovery and or healthy sexuality. 17, preferring fantasy over interacting with people in our lives, so much that fantasy creates a wall between ourselves and the real world. And 18, hiding the joys and pains of our lives from people we know and trust due to self-pity, false pride, and or fear. So I myself don't identify with all of them, but some of them definitely ring true. Number 6, acting out and then acting in. 15, the compulsive use of masturbation and pornography to avoid intimacy. Those are definite things for me. Some other ones stand out as well, but those are the go-to ones for me. And I will be leaving quite a few links in the show notes this week to this pamphlet and to finding the workshop recordings from past conventions. So that really covers what I wanted to talk about here at the beginning of the podcast, and I am going to turn it over to the conversation. It starts out with me talking about some weird green screen effects going on with my microphone. I was having a really weird reflection shining on my microphone. I could see it on Zoom, but I could not see it in person, and it was kind of a weird ghostly moment. And I could not figure it out. It wasn't until a meeting tonight, as I'm recording this, that I discovered that it was a cat hair in front of my camera on my computer, just kind of waving back and forth and looking like a light reflection on my microphone. So it was just kind of a weird thing. And so Deb and I were discussing that before getting to the actual recording. So anyway, it was a funny way to start our conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here it is. It's been weird. I did a thing where my green screen disappeared my mic. For some reason, it picked up the green hue, and then all of a sudden my mic disappeared. Yeah. Anyway, I am super happy to have you, Deb, here on the podcast. Long time ago, I had heard your recordings from the conventions on intimacy and sexual avoidance. And when I started recording the podcast, I had a couple of episodes where I talked about my own issues, and I had mentioned at that point, maybe someday I can have, someone on in particular to talk about intimacy and sexual avoidance. And that person is you. So I was, really happy to connect at the convention. It's weird that we did it over Zoom this year. So not in person, but we were able to exchange information and get you here on the podcast. So welcome.
Great. Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, yeah, typically at the beginning of the podcast, I like to get a better understanding of who we are. So, one of the questions I usually start off with is what are your circles? Inner circle, middle circle, outer circle?
All right. Well, I'm happy to share that. My name is Deb. I'm from West Virginia. I am recovering in SAA from Intimacy Avoidance, which shows up as compulsive sexual behaviors and sexual anorexia. And my inner circle behaviors contain behaviors that I want to stop, behaviors that I'm powerless over or that I'm unable to stop when I want, behaviors that are devoid of intimacy or self-respect, behaviors that lead to demoralization, abusive, painful, costly, or cause suffering, things that I keep secret that revealing would have negative consequences, behaviors that I use to numb discomfort or avoid responsibility, and behaviors that create a drug-like state that alters thinking. And they include focusing on other people's body parts for longer than 3 seconds, dressing in ways that objectify myself, which draws attention to my body parts, dressing in nondescript or baggy clothing to mask my gender or shape, sexual thoughts about having sex or sexual behavior with animals, romantic obsession. I have a 3-second rule with that. Escaping into fantasy while being sexual with my partner. Again, a 3-second rule. Being sexual when I don't want to. Reading or watching erotic or suggestive material like novels and porn. Euphoric recall. Again, a 3-second rule. Intentional sexual fantasy that is degrading, abusive, or focuses on non-reality, masturbation or self-stimulation solo, listening to or saying innuendos or sexual jokes, and sex to change the way I feel. And those are because I'm learning a healthier sexuality, which bonds and connects me with my partner and helps me feel closer to my higher power. So these things don't bring me towards that. And so that's why they're in my inner circle.
Wow. That is an impressive list. My basic list for years has been viewing, downloading, collecting to pornography and masturbation to pornography and voyeurism, and that kind of ties up everything. Just recently, I've been working the steps again, and I had not visited my circles in a long time, and working the steps through my second time, I worked on intimacy and sexual avoidance issues and had to kind of find a way to identify when I am in inner circle behaviors from avoidant behaviors. And that is a difficult thing to do. And for me, I can tell that it is far inner circle when my wife and I have gone for more than a month without any physical or emotional connection. So it doesn't necessarily have to be sex, but there are times where we're in the same house, but are just in two completely different worlds. So
I relate to that. In fact, that's in my middle circle because there may perhaps, theoretically, perhaps could be a reason medically, or maybe we're separated physically because of whatever reasons, So I had to put that in my middle circle so that I didn't accidentally need to reset my days for something, that there was a good explanation for, but it's definitely a warning sign that something is not the way I would like it to be. So, Yeah.
Any other middle circle?
Oh behaviors? Yeah. My middle circle is twice as big as my inner circle. Nice. And my outer circle is like 4 times as big.
Yeah,
I try to live in the yeses.
Yeah.
When I started recovery, there were certain sexual positions that I needed to have in my inner circle because they did cause emotional flashbacks from trauma. They caused feelings of demoralization. They did not connect me with my partner. They created friction and distance. And then over healing, after about a year of working the steps and talking with my sponsor, we tentatively put them in my middle circle because there are some circumstances where they're okay. And they've remained in middle circle because potentially they could bring up those things again, or be used like a drug to get high. So I don't want to, I just want to be careful about that.
Mm-hmm.
But they aren't just completely never know. So there's been some shifting and adapting. Also, middle circle behaviors, omitting daily prayer and quiet time with my higher power, avoiding my feelings or using distraction to make sure that I'm not feeling things, isolation, spending time alone for longer than is rational or reasonable. I don't have a specific time on that. That's why it's in middle circle, because I don't have a definite start or stop boundary. My things in my inner circle need to be very clearly defined so that I know when I'm crossing that boundary. And it's usually a choice of some sort, but my middle circle behaviors, I might, like having a victim attitude, I might suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I'm having a victim attitude. It's not like I'm going to have a victim attitude today. It's not a choice. So even things that don't have anything to do with sexuality, like multitasking, hoarding, emotional eating, fearful response to things, like I mentioned, going longer than 30 days without intercourse, staying up late. Those are all potentially slippery behaviors, not always, but multitasking, for example, can be very intimacy avoidant for me. It's one of my biggest things that I struggle with, but I'm also a woman, a mother. I have 4 children, so sometimes I had more than one fellowship, so sometimes multitasking happens. It's sort of a necessity.
It's necessary.
But when I'm finding myself unable to be present with someone or in a situation, that urge to look at my phone and check the emails instead of converse with somebody in a group setting, for example, that's intimacy avoidance. Very, very clearly. Yeah. Not speaking up, not using my voice, refraining from expressing feelings, building resentment. There's a whole bunch of stuff that are warning signs that I'm in a zone that I don't want to be. So I try to move into outer circle.
Yeah, I started identifying different feelings and emotions and putting those into my middle circle, as I hadn't really thought about that. In the step group that I'm going through, we explored feelings, and I did not realize, when you mentioned feeling like a victim, it's like, oh yeah, big time.
That also reminds me that I have not only just behaviors, but I also have symptoms or triggers. Also, I have a list of triggers, like being around arguing is a trigger for me, and that could potentially lead me to want to medicate and go into other middle circle or inner circle behaviors. Men raising their voice, children ignoring me or disobeying me. Being with my family of origin is in my middle circle. Feeling frustrated, physical pain, being sick, so that was really helpful for me to list that in my middle circle, just to be aware. When I'm in middle circle, I need extra care, extra caution, more, spending more time doing outreach calls and connecting with others in the fellowship, connecting with myself, with my higher power, to slow it down, just be extra and pay attention. And I don't have it on here, but I'm just realizing that recovery anniversary days are also sometimes, I just celebrated 9 years, and I forget sometimes because I don't usually experience it, but right around the year anniversary, sometimes for a few days before and a few days after, I'll get like withdrawal symptoms, like moodiness and nightmares, acting out dreams, all this stuff. And, I'm like, what the heck? I'm like frantically looking like, is there something, going on with my program? And I'm like, okay, look at the calendar. Okay. It's a thing for me, and I'm not alone, and that's helpful, but I need to put that in my middle circle. So,
nice.
For awareness.
The ever growing circles.
Yep.
Some of the things that and we'll get to this later, the most recent workshop you did at the convention around how to tell if your sponsee is acting in. Some of the behaviors that you listed there are definite middle circle things for me. with surrounding hygiene, not showering, I've got the big beard, but I do other beard grooming things if I neglect that, and other types of things, taking care of myself, getting the proper amount of sleep. Those things are definite middle circle territory for me, and I hadn't really identified those before, and so I made sure that I put those things in there. All right. And how about outer circle? And you don't need to list everything.
I will. There's a lot, but
yeah.
One of my favorite things about my outer circle is because I'm a recovering control freak too. I can use that character strength that sometimes gets twisted into a defect in organizing my outer circle behaviors. So I started off with things that I want to continue doing daily and things that I want to try to implement doing daily, like, eating healthy foods in appropriate amounts and carrying a water bottle, evening prayer with my partner, checking in with my feelings, doing parts work several times a day, things like that. And then I have weekly things, and then I have monthly things and things I want to do at least once a year. And then I have some ideas for when I'm struggling, if I'm just really needing to get out of middle circle or to help manage a potential trigger, like being with my family of origin. Mm-hmm. The more of these things I have on deck, things to choose from. In fact, when I was new, I created a book with a calendar, like a scenic calendar. I just glued the calendar pictures back to back and then folded them in half so that it sort of made an odd-shaped long book kind of thing. And then I just used letter stickers to put all of this in there. And then on the top cover, it says, first pray, then ... And then I have outside things like sitting on the porch, going for a walk, counting the birds, etc., yard work, which I seldom do because it is outer circle. It's just not one of my favorite ones. Playing music is another section, whether it's singing music or listening to music, harmonizing with my friends or family. We love to sing in 4-part harmony, often around the dinner table, which is not recommended. Creative things like journaling or artwork, home improvement type things, if I want to like tidy up an area or deep clean something, fix something, reading and studying, like if there's new skills that I want, or meditation is in there in that section too, or connecting with others, including going out to lunch with a friend or writing letters. Do you remember before email, like snail mail, or sending a card to somebody, things like that. So yeah, I have a variety of things to choose from that, and they're not limited to any of these, of course, but it does kind of spark my imagination and get me thinking along the lines of, what do I need? What does my spirit need? For the sponsees that I have that only have a limited amount of things in their outer circle, sometimes they run out of ideas pretty quickly. Like, okay, I've done all 5 of those things and I still want to add out. Well, let's see if you can come up with 100 things for your outer circle. Wow. That doesn't mean you have to do it all the time, but you at least need more choices, because when my brain is offline, when I'm in fight or flight and I want to do something that's in my inner circle, I'm usually in fight or flight. My thinking brain is offline. And I can't very easily say, gee, I think I'll pause and pray and ask my higher power what outer circle behavior I can do. I can't rationalize and think through it. So having that book with the letter stickers, it's like, well, the prayer is 2 words, help me. And then I open the book and it's like, okay, is anything jumping out at me? It's like, balance the checkbook. Check, got it. I can do that, and there's just a yes to do. And then I focus on, okay, what's my next right thing? And that was so helpful at the beginning of my recovery.
Awesome. Yeah. I keep my guitars handy. So when I start to get a little squirrely, just, grab a guitar and start playing. When you mentioned singing, I know that you're in West Virginia. Is any of that bluegrass that you harmonize?
Yes, we do tend to get, we have a wide musical variety of tastes in my family. So We tend to gravitate towards choral music because it's slower and the harmonies are pretty pronounced there. But bluegrass is kind of like that too. It's a little bit slow in the harmonies. But we didn't. We've been here 11 years, but I didn't grow up here. I actually grew up in the Midwest, but I was born in California, so I keep moving more and more east.
Cool.
So I have, and I lived in South America for a little while, so I have an eclectic taste of of different music.
Yeah, and I remember in the convention in 2018 in Oakland, I did the workshop on music and recovery, and you were
I remember
there.
that. I attended that. Yeah. It was awesome.
But yeah, as big as metalhead as I am, I just love bluegrass and just have this heartfelt connection for Bill Monroe and Earl Scruggs, Flatt Scruggs and stuff. And so it's like when I heard you talking about harmony and stuff, it reminded me of bluegrass stuff. So
yeah, it's music touches me in a place that few things do, and it's been an important part of my recovery. And I actually helped start a meeting a few years ago called Sanctuary of Spirituality. It's a Zoom video meeting, so anybody
Sweet.
Can. And it's the original concept. Somebody was like wanting to be back in touch with their higher power, but could not stomach the idea of going to church. So they said, "Can we create a 12-step church?" And we were like, we'll give it a shot. So what are the elements of church? Well, there's music, there's a message, there's an offering, there's, and so we just kind of put that, those elements in there. And it's one of my favorite meetings because what's spiritual music to one person might be very different,
Oh, yeah.
We've had Native American drumming. We've had people singing their original songs. We've had people playing YouTube videos,
How cool.
There's just a wide variety of music, and it's focused on the 12 steps, anything that helps us understand or work the 12 steps of SAA better, and so it's just, I love that meaning because it's very different,
Yeah.
Newcomers are like, what are we singing for? What?
Fun. So thinking back to the 2018 convention, I remember that you have been integral with the ISA meetings, the telemeetings, and you were trying out Zoom back then. And I remember you guys talking about, we need to get Wi-Fi so we can set up this thing, and we're going to have people here in this room, and then other people will be able to join in on video. And that just boggled my mind. I couldn't understand, what the hell is this?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I want to touch on it later, but there was another thing that I did attend on the ISA awareness, that you sent out a flyer for, and I remember attending that. And at that point I really wanted to attend, but I was freaked out by the video aspect. So I called in for that. And then much later, I definitely favor video meetings over the phone because I have a better connection, being able to see someone and while we're talking. But I was wondering how you got involved in that in Zoom.
In Zoom. Well, whatever year the convention was in Chicago, I want to say 2015.
Could be.
I think something in there. There was a member of the Intimacy and Sexual Avoidance Awareness Committee that said his spouse from a different fellowship used Zoom for their meetings and suggested that we try it. And this other person and I looked at each other and went, hell no.
Yeah.
Intimacy avoidant. We just talk on the phone. We multitask while we're on the meetings. Hello, this is how we do this. We're not on video. What are you talking about? That's never going to fly. And that person was so persistent. I'm so grateful, just kept inviting us, and finally purchased a Zoom account and donated it to the Intimacy Avoidance meetings for a year to just test out. And we, tested it out, and there was a handful of people, and most were calling in with the phone. There were like two of us on video. And shortly after trying it for a few times, most people were afraid it was going to be triggering because they've used that for nefarious purposes. So I understand that. But we found out, oh, well, it's like Brady Bunch or Hollywood Square. That does date me a little bit, Everybody's in their own square, and it's not triggering in the way that I thought it would be. It's triggering in a different way because I have to see myself if I don't shut off my own picture, which I can do. But it took a little while to get used to, but I really appreciate being able to attend a meeting with people from all over the world. There are a couple of meetings that I attend that have usually people from at least 7 different countries. And that has just expanded my understanding of SAA as an international fellowship. It's given me people to connect with in a lot of different time zones, which is fabulous. I started sponsoring people outside the US, and it's just been so helpful for my recovery to just think outside of the little box that I was in. I started attending a local meeting, but it wasn't a very safe, healthy meeting for me. And so I quickly found the avoidance-focused telemeetings, and I have a long-distance sponsor. So I'm just grateful for electronic recovery. It's been super important to me. And the retreats and the convention are where I get to actually interact with people in person, and it's a big treat for me because I don't really have that, even on video. I mean, I've had the experience of meeting somebody that I was on phone meetings with in person at a retreat, and it's like awkward. It's like your face does not match your voice. We just turn our backs to each other and talk on the phone. This is awkward, And then once we started using Zoom, I met somebody that I had seen on the video meetings but had never seen, and it's like, well, they're a lot shorter in person than I had imagined. Because, we're sitting down, you can't tell, and it was just, and like, oh, they're 3D instead of 2D. Weird, but it's just, it adds a different layer of getting to know somebody when I can meet them in person, and it's terrific. But I'm grateful. There are people that I probably will never meet because they're on the other side of the planet, but I feel so close to them, because when we talk and share honestly and really build that spiritual connection and that emotional intimacy, it's just amazing how much that affects recovery. It's so important.
Yeah, definitely. When the pandemic hit and everything had to shut down, it was chaos. And we had been talking about using Zoom, trying to figure out how to utilize Zoom for our intergroup meetings, because we have probably 65 meetings around the Bay Area. And I myself spend a half a day commuting to various meetings to get, and I'll make a day out of it. I'll go up to San Francisco, do the San Francisco morning meeting, and then trek across the Bay to do the intergroup meeting. And by the time I get back home, it's about 3 p.m. And that was a stumbling block for a lot of people. And so we were researching ways for intergroup to use Zoom, and the pandemic hit, and it's like, oh shit. And so we struggled. We got links for all of our meetings within the first week, and figured out how to get the word out, and that was difficult, but it managed. I talk a lot on the podcast about some particular meetings. In Silicon Valley, which is where I live and work, we had 3 noon meetings that a lot of us attended, and it would be roughly 20 to 25 people, and we put those on Zoom during the pandemic. And then those were only Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Tuesday and Thursday. Everyone loved being on Zoom Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Why not be on Zoom on Tuesday and Thursday as well? And since those ones had no face-to-face meetings, we put those on the ISO website, and we started getting people from across the world. So on our local meetings, we were getting people from Australia, and from the UK, from South Africa, from the Middle East. And And, not to mention just the various parts of the contiguous United States, a lot of people from Canada. And so we've become this close-knit family, and without the power of Zoom, we wouldn't have had that. So.
Absolutely. I am so grateful. And it was funny that, the few people in intimacy avoidance recovery were getting all the phone calls and stuff. How do you run a Zoom? We did a lot of training.
Yeah.
And I just find it funny that it's the intimacy avoidant people that started using Zoom in SAA. That's just
yeah.
The irony.
So going back to that, how did you get? I think I remember from your story, you came into the program with avoidant behaviors to begin with.
Yes. It was actually codependency that brought me into SAA. I didn't join SAA to work on codependency. I didn't know what that was, but I went online to research S fellowships for somebody else because they were not recovering fast enough in the all-purpose 12-step fellowship that we had been attending for 6 months. So I was going to help that person. And so I started researching fellowships that start with the letter S, and I came across the pamphlet, which at the time was called Recovery from Compulsive Sexual Avoidance, a Return to Intimacy. And I said, what's that? And I started reading through this list of 18 symptoms. And I started going, oh, check. And I started crying, but it was like with gratitude. It was kind of a strange experience. I called my mom in tears of joy saying, Mom, guess what? I'm a sex addict. And, she was like, why are we happy about this? I don't understand. Not the typical response, but I was overjoyed to finally understand what was going on with me. And, I never would have labeled my behaviors as sex addiction. That was the other person I was doing the research for. But my behaviors looked a bit different. But I started to realize, even though some of them were compulsive avoidance of sex, and they were also compulsively avoiding closeness and connection with myself, with other people, with my higher power, I started to see intimacy avoidance, avoiding closeness and connection and trust and relationship and depth in all of the areas of my life. I also started to realize, oh, this thing is a compulsive sexual behavior. Oh, so is this and so is that. That those qualify. They are behaviors that are sex related, that am not choosing, that don't serve me or help me in my life, and that are actually serving to avoid being present, like the fantasy, for example. I mean, and it wasn't just sexual fantasy, it was fantasy of any sort, and I through working the steps and poking around with the first fourth step and subsequent fourth steps, I've starting to delve a little bit more and more deeply each time I work the steps into my history as a child and why these behaviors developed to help me cope with stressful and overwhelming experiences. I don't have a ton of trauma in my life in regards to some that I've heard of, but I do have there are wounds that were caused and very quickly, and because of early sexualization, it became very easy, to just escape into fantasy. It was I have a wonderful imagination, and so I used it to not be here, and now I'm using my imagination to envision what I want for myself, to, visualization. I'm using my imagination to sponsor creatively, because sometimes I have sponsees that I have no clue what to say or how to help them. They're like, try everything I suggest, and they're still like, nope, not working. I'm like, okay,
let's try this.
Myself down and some random strange thing pops into my head. I'm like, thanks, higher power, let's try this, and it works. Like, wow, obviously not me. But if I weren't accustomed to using my imagination and thinking outside the box and not being stuck in just my intellect, I probably wouldn't, that gift wouldn't be as developed, so in a way I'm grateful for it. It can be helpful, but it can also be frustrating. Because I also think I can see the future and read people's minds. That defect tends to show up sometimes, and that's not helpful. So
Yeah, that pamphlet. I came into the program in 2002 and started working on the steps in 2004. So about a year and a half after I had been in program. Um, and the persistent problem that I had with my wife and is that I would be acting out with porn and avoiding sex, uh, uh, any sort of intimacy with her, and so once I stopped acting out and started working on my first step, started working on spiritual growth, I still was not connecting with my wife. And we're still having the same old arguments. And why is this still happening? What good is it to be married to a sex addict that doesn't want to have sex? And
Right.
yeah, it's just one of those weird things. I got to the fourth step and I had no fears coming into this program, and it's like I don't understand why I need to do a fear inventory until one day I sat down and started writing, and it's like, oh shit. And then once I got into conflict avoidance, um and the fear of intimacy, once I hit that, it's like, oh, okay, this is something. And I went through further step work. I don't know if I had already gotten all the way through the steps, but I went to speak at a different meeting than I usually attend, and they had that pamphlet on the compulsive sexual avoidance, return to intimacy, and I had not seen that at any of my meetings before. I picked it up and started reading. It's like, oh, this connects. And I brought it home, put it in my wife's hands. This is why I act this way.
Yes.
Yeah. So at the beginning of this podcast, I will read through the 18 symptoms. I usually do at the beginning some sort of program reading, but that's one that I definitely want to use for this one.
Right.
But yeah, I didn't connect with all of them, but there were certain ones that's like, oh, bam, that is me. Years before, I had been at one of our local retreats to a workshop on sexual anorexia, and I'd never identified myself as an anorexic. And it's like, I'm interested to hear what these people have to say about sexual anorexia. I don't understand it. And when they started talking, it's like, I'm identifying with a lot of this. And so it was interesting for me. That was, those two things were the things that opened up my eyes to it. And I had mentioned before that, I had found various convention recordings on the subject, and you had been leading most of those workshops, and forever grateful for those. So that's awesome. One of the confusing things that has been is the evolution of the identification from sexual anorexia to compulsive sexual avoidance to intimacy and sexual avoidance and stuff. And I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. I was just thinking about that. The term sexual anorexia came from a certain member.
You can say his name. Patrick Carnes.
Patrick Carnes, yes. And I'm so grateful. And he wrote a book to that effect, which has been really helpful in pairing the 12 steps with 12 dimensions of healthier sexuality. Mm-hmm. And I won't talk a whole lot more about that right now, but that's been super helpful for people that are working the steps on intimacy avoidance, especially nurturing and sensory activities for step 1 and step 2. But the term anorexia actually means, ano means without, and exia means appetite. And, a lot of people in this fellowship don't identify with that. They say, well, I wish that was my problem. Right. And I think when I think of food anorexia, I'm thinking of a person that starves themselves of nourishing food. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't have an appetite.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they usually do, but they're denying their appetite. And so the word doesn't really match what we're getting at, if that makes sense. You know, it's more like denial of appetite rather than not having one in the first place. So with sexual anorexia, it's the same thing. You know, with me, it manifested in a lot of different ways. But one way was like where in my head, I was obsessed with sex. But when I had an opportunity to be sexual with my partner, I felt like dead from the neck down. I'm borrowing a phrase from a sponsee of mine. My body would not respond. And I'm like, this makes no sense. Why am I stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time? I don't understand, you know, and I thought I am so messed up, you know, and I started to see it in a lot of little ways where anytime I would have a sexual thought or feeling, I would freak out and shut it down, you know, thinking it was dirty or wrong, you know, subconsciously. And I would always fantasize about other people being sexual. I would put it as far away from me as possible. I was never in my own fantasies. So, you know, I could go on about that. But the thing was when I first started attending the phone meetings that focused on sexual anorexia in 2012, there were 3 of them at the time. I only knew about 2 of them. And I noticed that a lot of the people that called in were just doing 90 and 90 and they needed a meeting, or they, you know, weren't paying much attention. They accidentally called into the phone meeting or whatever, you know, and they said, well, I'm not, when they identified at the beginning, they said, I'm not sure if I belong here, but I'll stay and listen. And by the end of the meeting, like a high percentage of them were just what I just heard, you know, like, oh my gosh, I actually identify with this stuff. What does this mean? You know, how can I be an anorexic and an addict at the same time? But a lot of the people more strongly related to intimacy avoidance. They might not have really resonated with the term anorexia, but they really identified with the avoidance of closeness, connection, relationship with just having building the trust and taking the time to get to know themselves and other people, both platonically and sexually. So over time, more and more people started identifying as an intimacy avoidant rather than a sexual anorexic. Plus, there's another fellowship that uses that term too. And just to more fully distinguish us and to more focus on what the majority of people were actually resonating with, I noticed that the term acting in slowly started to fade, and so acting in, it's cute in English, right? Acting out, acting in, they're opposites, you know, and when you try to translate it in other languages, it does not work. They don't even call it acting out in a lot of other languages. The out isn't even part of it. It's act or consume or something like that, you know. So acting in, they don't know how to translate it. And it, you know, like in Spanish, the current literature says something like acting inside of oneself. And, you know, people that speak Spanish are like, what the? You know, I'm like, I know, we need to work on this, you know. So by the time, you know, there started to be more and more meetings that began and started to use the term intimacy and sexual avoidance, because people do identify with compulsive sexual avoidance, which is another word for sexual anorexia, but it's a little bit less stigmatized, I guess, is with the anorexia. But still, so many people in this fellowship don't resonate with the compulsive avoidance of sex. They compulsively have sex, but they do compulsively avoid intimacy when they're being sexual. You know? So that's where they really identify with it. And that's why the literature committee decided to not only retitle the compulsive sexual avoidance pamphlet, but also kind of update it. They took out some of the phrases and updated some things in there and clarified some things. And now it's titled Intimacy Avoidance, Another Aspect of Sex Addiction. And I think there's a lot more people that are going to pay attention to that and not just say, oh, I don't resonate with that, and not even read it. Because there's stuff about voyeurism and porn in there. You know, that's being compulsively sexual. That's not avoiding sex. You know what I mean? So I think the title was deceptive. And now this kind of helps people when they're ready, to invite them to take a look. If a person isn't coming into the fellowship with that goal or that knowledge, like I did, if they are trying to stop acting out, it may be TMI, you know what I mean? It's very confusing, and it's probably easier for them to just simply work the steps with the focus of stopping acting out and, kind of scrape off that first layer. And then when that's not front and center, they'll see all kinds of things underneath the surface. That's usually what happens.
Yeah, that's what happened for me.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I had seen in your presentations and other things using the metaphor of the iceberg, and the acting out kind of being the tip of the iceberg above the water, and then all the emotional intimacy avoidant behaviors below, the 2/3 that are below.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that comes from that pamphlet. I didn't make that up, but it's a great analogy. It's a good visual, And then the little, I have, created some PowerPoints with the little SS intimacy that's floating along happy, and it is looming this big iceberg. And it doesn't matter if it's acting out or intimacy avoidance. It's still an iceberg. It's still going to destroy your intimacy. So, we don't want any part of the iceberg.
And that little scuba diver.
Peeking around the corner of the, I like that.
Yeah. So that I think it is hitting a lot of people, especially at this past convention. A lot of people jumped in on the ISA meetings, and it's like, I did not know this was a thing, and holy shit, I identify with a lot of this. And I know the director of the ISO has been wanting to get the word out more about intimacy and sexual avoidance. And I know you've done the ISA awareness, and you've done a number of things for the ISO on committee levels.
I am on several board committees. I sort of accidentally got dragged into being on the women's outreach committee because I volunteered. I was going to go to a retreat, and I volunteered to bring some colored pencils. And the next thing I knew, I was getting these emails inviting me to these meetings to plan the retreat. I'm like, I don't see why I have to do that, but okay. Yeah. So I join the meeting and say, yep, I'm bringing my colored pencils. Why am I here? But it kind of eased me into all the work that goes into something like that, which eased me into the Women's Outreach Committee. And so when somebody said, hey, do you want to resurrect the intimacy and sexual at the time it was called the Compulsive Sexual Avoidance Outreach Committee, this one other person and I are like, yeah, we'll help. And they said, well, I can't be the chair because I'm involved in too many other things. So I signed you up as chair, Deb, but I'll act as chair. I'm like, okay. And then they promptly disappeared, leaving me in charge of I did not know what. I mean, at that time, actually, that came first before the Women's Outreach Committee. And I did not even know we were a board committee. I didn't know we were supposed to be reporting to anybody or having minutes or an agenda or anything. I did not know any of this. So for about a year or so, this other person and I, and occasionally some other people, would just plan how to help the intimacy avoidance meetings. And suddenly this guy named Joe from Texas joined our meeting, and he seemed to know a lot about the ISO. And so I asked some questions, and he kind of informed me of some things. And then he said, I'll email you some information. And when he did, it was Joe H., Director, ISO of SAA. And I'm like, I just feel like I got called into the principal's office or reining in this rogue. We didn't know. So it was an odd beginning in international service, but yeah, I'm still involved, and I'm appreciating supporting, raising awareness within the community, and trying to think of ways that we could invite other people outside of SAA to come explore. But often we get people from other fellowships that say, hey, we've heard that there's a better intimacy avoidance program in your fellowship than there is in ours. And I'm like, Cool.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to join.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's there's no competition. I mean, there's a place for everything, but
Yeah, if it works for you, go for it.
yeah.
We've had a number of people, newcomers. I'm just blown away. One of our guys, he just did his first step this week, and he is concurrently working on. He's only been in program for a little bit, but he's working an ISA step study as well as acting out step study, and there gets to be a confusion, and people have had me try to clear it up about, is ISA part of SAA? And I said, yes, it is. And it's just a different aspect of our program.
Yep.
And so, yeah, just trying to clear up the confusion early on in
Sure.
the podcast. I had someone that emailed in that asking me to clarify between ISA and ISO,
I know,
which
right?
are very close to each other, but very, very different. So,
I know.
so yeah, I was wondering if you see it as a subset of SAA or something completely different.
Definitely it's SAA. It's all sex addiction. It's just usually looked at as the other side of the coin of
Mm-hmm.
sex addiction. And a lot of us experience a kind of bulimia where we'll flip between acting out and acting in, or intimacy avoidance, even though acting out is technically intimacy avoidance. Is all the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
The coin is actually not sex addiction. The coin is intimacy avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
The intimacy avoidance, like I said at the beginning, I identify as recovering from intimacy avoidance, which shows up as compulsive sexual behaviors and sexual anorexia, the compulsive avoidance of sex. And I could be acting out and acting in at the same time by being sexual when I don't really want to be, and being lost in fantasy. That's intimacy avoidance, and it's also acting out for me. Those are inner circle behaviors. So and just other compulsive sexual behaviors, they don't bring me closeness and connection. They serve to distance me from my emotions, distance me from another person. They're often, if I really look at acting out behaviors, there's hatred and fear there. That's the base of acting out behaviors. It's not about love, which is what I want sex to be. I want it to be loving. I want it to be an expression of faith and a way to bond and have unity and connection and tenderness. I mean, I was floored to learn that sex was supposed to be nurturing. I mean, a jaw drop. I mean, those two things never went together in my mind. And when that concept was presented to me, I remember doing a double take and going, what? It's like, well, I guess I better learn what nurturing is, because, I thought, well, that's something you do with young children and plants, or animals being brought back from nearly dying. How do I nurture myself? What does that look like as an adult? And to know that sex was supposed to be nurturing. Well, that was why it was so important with step one. Step one is nurturing too. Step one is admitting we're in pain. I mean, admitting that I have a problem is one thing, but implied with step one, we don't talk about this a whole lot, but there's many people that can say, yeah, I have a problem, and not do anything about it. But step one is not only admit that we have a problem, but we start letting help in. That's the nurturing. We open our hearts and share, and we let people get close, and we let people help. So without that piece, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to just say, yep, I got some problems, And step two, with sensory experiences, again, when I was lost in fantasy, it wasn't about my five senses and being present and really experiencing what was going on. It was all about escaping what was going on, because what was going on, for me, it subconsciously reminded me of trauma, sexual trauma. And so that may not be the case for everybody, but I know it is the case for some people. There may be many reasons why people escape into fantasy while they're being sexual, but it's fear-based. It's fear and anger. I had a hatred towards people of the male gender, because of males that had hurt me in the past. And sometimes it was less conscious, but it's always been there up until recovery, and it's affected my life. Really, it's had a negative impact. So learning how to see everybody as human beings, both myself and other people of all genders, learning how to open my heart, learning how to be present in a moment and pay attention to what my senses are telling me. What am I actually seeing or hearing or smelling or tasting or feeling with my skin, and experiencing my higher power through those things. I can't really experience my higher power through my five senses, but I can, if that makes sense. I mean, when I'm aware of what my senses are telling me, I am opening up to more information. And that's how I let higher power guidance come in. When I'm up in my head, that's a danger zone for me. I used to theorize and rationalize and a lot of things that end in lies, sexualize, fantasize. But I learned how to drop down into my heart space and open up to what was going on, what's real, and how do I receive intuitive guidance, and how do I know what's true for me, what resonates, what do I need to keep at a distance, what spiritual principles can I apply in this moment. And all of this I learned in SAA. The steps are very simple and they're expressions of spiritual principles, but the interpretation of those spiritual principles and the application of those spiritual principles can go in a lot of different directions, which is why even though trauma is an outside issue, people can definitely heal from trauma by doing some of the step work. Sometimes, yes, it does necessitate an outside, therapist or something.
Yeah, therapist, yeah.
But for me, I've gained much more help with trauma recovery in SAA than I have ever with therapists. Now, that says a lot about the crappy therapists I worked with, but we won't. I'm just saying, there's a lot of healing that has taken place because of the application of the spiritual principles of the 12 steps. So to circle back to your question, I see intimacy avoidance as another lens of applying the 12 steps of SAA to this particular aspect of my life. And, even in the Green Book, the fourth step talks about potentially a person can work an inventory on any emotion. Like shame. I asked my sponsor if we could do a shame inventory, and she said, well, I've never done that before, but sure, we'll make it up, and since then I've done grief inventories and intimacy and sex inventories, not just sexual behavior, but connection. Like, did I want to be friends with the person on the playground? What happened? Positive examples, negative examples, outcomes that were pleasing and outcomes that weren't. Looking for patterns, what are my intimacy related patterns? And doing that as part of my inventory has been really revealing. I've learned where I have control issues. I've learned what my hot buttons are, where, I shut down or go into fight, flight, freeze, appease. And knowing that about myself can help me prepare for situations where I'm likely to have that, one of those sensitivities triggered. I can prepare ahead of time with on my list of all my outer circle activities that I can do and people that I can outreach with and things that I can do to ground myself and calm down my nervous system and to tap into higher power energy and, and take care of myself if I need to, like put some distance, And it's just been so healing and so helpful for my life. And my whole family is being impacted. I'm not the only one in recovery in my home, but I'm the one that's working. I can't say.
You're doing a lot of work.
My recovery. Yeah. And everybody is being impacted positively, So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were talking about the nurturing aspect of sexuality, I remember times where I would be acting out and just filled with shame, and my wife would put out the feelers, hey, I would like to be with you, and it's like I am just all up in my head and just not present, and my wall goes up, and I just want to find ways to avoid it. And so I'll stay up late at night watching a movie and just pretend and then come to bed late, and then so on and so forth. And when it does come time to actually being intimate, I remember specifically going through my fourth step inventory and just the erectile dysfunction issues that I had, because I was so freaked out about it. And we were at that point in time, we were trying to conceive, so there's a lot of pressure there as well. But once I was able to recognize where that fear was coming from, and having a list of outer circle activities to let that go. I connect a lot with music, so there's certain music that I listen to that really brings me back and just drops the level of anxiety. Listen to that, and then go up to bed, and I can be emotionally present. And then when we connect, it's this amazing thing, and it's like, why am I so scared of this? Why every time it is awesome? There have been times where it hasn't ended up the way that either of us wanted, but yeah, for 9 times out of 10, it's just this awesome thing. And yet when the topic comes up, let's have sex tonight, and then my adrenaline starts spiking and just like all that. But one of the aspects of the steps and character defects and character assets, practicing the opposite, when I'm now able to recognize those fears coming up, I can say, oh, I need to act in this opposite way, kind of open myself up instead of closing myself off. And that's been really good. And one of the things I did write down in my circles this past year was taking risks in our sexuality, in I forget how I termed it, that it was okay with the both of us. So we have explored some stuff that went way, way out there, and we've checked in with each other, and it's like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And we check in with each other regularly around that sort of stuff. But not taking those risks doesn't lead to any growth. And so I was, grateful that we were starting to ask each other about, you know, what we would like to explore. Are there any fantasies out there that you want to indulge in? And we have this great conversation, no shame involved there, and it's been amazing. And for years and years and years, I had been fearing having any sort of conversation like that, and I think it's really opened us up. And without working the steps around these issues, I don't know if I would have ever have landed in a headspace like that. So, and some artwork that I really connect with, and other things that shows the aura of people, and when they're connected. And my wife pointed out a specific piece of artwork, and she's like, that is us when we are connecting. And it's a visual representation of people connecting, and there's like you can see this artwork behind me. This is part of the artwork of Alex Gray, and he does a lot of things with flames and eyes and rainbows and stuff. And he has the connections of chakras between a couple, and little infinity flame loops and stuff. And so I'm looking at this artwork, and she's like, this, when we're connecting, this is what it feels like. And it's like, yeah, that is awesome. And that's what I think the program is striving for, healthier sexuality. And so it's not just about doing it, not about having the orgasm or avoiding it. It's that level of connection. And so I fear that. And but I have the steps, I have a higher power, I have outer circle things that take me out of that fear. And so truly grateful for the program for that.
Yes, me too. Like slowing things down. I didn't realize that eye contact was not a thing for me. When I actually had to really focus and try to make eye contact while being sexually intimate, I realized, wow, that's uncomfortable for me. In order to stay in fantasy, I have to avoid eye contact. Eye contact brings me back to the moment, and then I can see the love in my partner's eyes, and it freaks me out.
Yeah.
And dialogue, oh my goodness, that was awkward at first. It's like, well, we're supposed to be talking. What do we talk about? How was your day? I mean, no, that's not helpful. What do we share? And so we had to kind of be like people that hadn't had any experiences at all, and just like higher power pressed the reset button for us. And it's been wonderful to just like, okay, I'm going to express that I'm really nervous right now. I'm afraid I'm going to say or do something and it's going to blow this moment, and I'm going to mess it up, and that vulnerability actually leads to deeper connection. Express how we feel in the moment, whatever we're feeling. It could be a bunch of different things, but that is and I always thought, how can people be married for decades and have it not get boring and have to spice it up and stuff like that? Well, now I understand something I didn't understand before. Every time is different, because on a cellular level we're different. Each of us has had experiences since the last time we connected, and we're reconnecting, we're upgrading, we're what do you call it, we're like energy exchange, download. We're getting to know each other of like, okay, there's been some changes, what has changed? And it can be subconscious, it usually is, but we've had things that have impacted us positively and negatively, and being able to kind of recalibrate, I guess, and to share that kind of psychic or spiritual information by being close and connected in that way, it makes everything new. Every experience is not all of them are wonderful,
Yeah.
just said, and releasing the outcome into the hands of the higher power has been great too. We connect however we connect, whatever happens, but the goal is to connect, and we do. And I love it. I never thought that I could just fall in love with my partner over and over again, and the behaviors themselves aren't really, there's not a wide variety, there's a limited amount of variety, and that's okay. Because I don't need the variety. I don't need the novelty. I don't need to go outside of certain things, because it's what's inside that's connecting with what's inside my partner that makes that alive. And it just it's an experience that I never imagined could be possible, And like I said, I don't have to fear. I still do. I still have a visceral response sometimes, and that's beyond I'm powerless over that. But when we invite our higher power into that moment, higher power helps us do what we cannot do alone. And that's so necessary for me, and
Absolutely.
that was awkward too. So yeah. God, I'm going to have sex. Are you okay with that? I mean, what do you do? But yeah, absolutely. So it's been key.
Well, this is fantastic. We're coming up on an hour here. Before we close it out, is there anything you wanted to share with the podcast community? Anything that we didn't cover that you would like to cover?
I can't think of anything. I'm good.
All right, cool. Yeah. So I imagine that I'll be covering this topic again. And a lot of times I'll do one-on-one interviews like this, or have groups where we have a topic discussion. So I would love to have you as part of a future discussion on intimacy and sexual avoidance.
Sweet. That'd be awesome.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me, Deb.
Thanks for inviting me. This has been great.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Much appreciation for Deb coming out and having this conversation. This was amazing. I really enjoyed this. And furthering our conversation on intimacy and sexual avoidance. I've been hearing it a lot at my meetings, at the convention, at various things at the retreat. And it's something that I think we're going to need to be talking about a lot more in the future. After we were done with the actual recording, we talked a little bit about some links that we can leave here at the end. In addition to the pamphlet that I read from the beginning, Intimacy Avoidance, Deb also wanted me to mention that there is a first step guide for intimacy avoidance. In addition to that, we were also talking about how the ISO is going to be updating their website soon, which is saa-recovery.org. The Intimacy and Sexual Avoidance Awareness Group has written material that's going to be updating on the ISO's website soon. So hopefully that will be another facet to share information about ISA. And as I had mentioned before, in the conversation and in previous episodes, the difference between ISA and ISO can be quite confusing. ISA is Intimacy and Sexual Avoidance, and ISO is the International Service Organization. And some other things that we talked about afterwards was SAAtalk.info, which is a website for the telemeetings intergroup. And on there are a list of different telemeetings that are available, but also a lot of resources. So if you go to SAAtalk.info and click on the resources page, there's a lot of stuff there about ISA, including a sponsorship guide, a resources list, links to different recordings. So if you're interested in checking that out. Deb mentioned also that there are links there for starting your own step study around intimacy and sexual avoidance. In addition to ISA resources, there's also a group called Sponsors Helping Sponsors, and they have a lot of recorded meetings and information on SAAtalk.info as well. So if you're interested in any of that, check out SAAtalk.info, and I'll leave the links in the show notes. And to get a hold of me, if you're interested in being on the podcast or part of a panel, you can email me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. If you want to leave feedback for any of the previous episodes, anything about the podcast in general that you'd like to share on the podcast, any questions that you have that you would like answered, you can leave an email at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. And with that, I am going to close out this episode and say I am grateful for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.